Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel Automation in Detail. Shiva here. In this video, we will talk about mobile app automation and I'll explain what happens behind the scenes when Appium session is created and when we find an element and perform click operation. But before we get into those details, let me first give you a brief overview of Appium's architecture. Let me open the PPT. Yep. And one more thing is that in this video, I'll explain architecture with respect to Android platform alone. The reason being, I don't want to make this video too big and also confuse you guys with all the components that are involved in these two platforms. I'll create a separate video for iOS. In this video, let's stick to Android. Okay. Now coming to the architecture, Appium basically operates using client-server architecture, which means it functions as a server that communicates with client-side libraries to automate mobile applications. For that, Appium provides client libraries in different programming languages such as Java, Python, C#, Ruby, JavaScript, which allows users to write test scripts in different programming languages. Okay, and these libraries are based on the W3C WebDriver Protocol, which enables communication with the Appium server. Let me show you how it looks. Okay, so this is the website where you can see that to find an element and click on it in Java, we write like this. When it comes to the Python, it looks like this, and in Ruby, C# and JavaScript. But for our demo purpose, I'm currently using Java programming language for the execution. Okay, now each and every line of code written using Appium client libraries will be converted into respective W3C WebDriver Protocol HTTP request. Okay, and it will be sent to Appium server. Now, after receiving the request, Appium server will determine how to execute it based on the type of mobile platform, that is iOS or Android. If in this request, if the platform name is set to Android and automation name is UI Automator 2, then it creates a new session with UI Automator 2 driver and it delegates this task of creating session request to it. Now, UI Automator 2 driver uses the ADB commands to install the UI Automator 2 server, which is an HTTP server on the requested Android device or the emulator. So ADB actually stands for Android Debug Bridge. It is a command line tool which is part of Android Software Development Kit, and it is used to communicate with the Android device or emulator. Now, once this UI Automator 2 server is installed, then the testing application will also be installed on the emulator. Then Appium again uses these ADB commands to start this UI Automator 2 server on the device. Now, this server is responsible for handling all UI interactions on the application and report it back to the Appium. So how does it do that? It actually uses the APIs of UI Automator framework to perform actions such as locating element and interacting with it and performing gestures. So what is UI Automator framework? It is a native testing framework provided by the Android to interact with and automate UI components both in applications and in the system UI. So this is part of Android SDK, and here the UI Automator 2 server is actually acting as a bridge between the Appium client and the native UI Automator framework. Now, once it is installed, UI Automator 2 server, once it is installed and started, the UI Automator 2 driver will route the create session command request to the UI Automator 2 server. Now after receiving the request, UI Automator 2 server creates a new session and respond back to the UI Automator 2 driver with status code, session ID and all the device details. Okay. Now let us go back to the the code which I have written, and I'll explain the method initialize driver. Okay, but before getting to that, I'll also show you the version of Java client which I'm using, which is 9.3.0. Okay, let us go to this initialize driver method. Now here I'm setting the path of the testing application for Android and iOS, and I'm storing it in Android app path variable. And here, right, in the switch case, I am using two variables, that is Android and iOS switch case. and I'm using UI Automator 2 options class to determine, sorry, to set the all the capabilities, that is platform name as Android and the automation name as UI Automator 2, and the AVD name, that is the Android virtual device name, Pixel 8 Pro, that is, this is the device which we will be using for this demo, and also the app path, the testing application path, which I have stored it in Android app path variable. I'm sending it to the set app method, and also AVD launch time mode, I'm setting it to 5 minutes. Now it is not needed that much time actually, because initially for initial setup, right, it requires a little bit more time, but now it works quickly. And also the new command time mode, I have set it to 2 minutes. Now this will, after setting all the details, right, so it will return the Android Appium driver, sorry, the Android driver, and this method will return the Appium driver that I'm currently storing it here. And after that, I'm trying to find an element that is the graphics, and after finding that, I'll be clicking on that. Let me show you the application which we'll be using for this demo, and this is the API demos. Let me open this. Now this is the element which we will be finding, and once found, we'll click on it. Okay, so after this, we will quit the driver, and the respective messages will also be printed. Now what I will do, let me uninstall this application, because I want to show from the beginning how it installs the application, then it launches and performs the respective actions. Okay, let me install that. Okay, so it is uninstalled. As you can see that it is not present anywhere here. Okay, let me open the terminal, and I'll launch this server, Appium server. Okay, Appium server is started. Let me zoom it a bit. Okay, so as you can see here, the Appium server version is 2.11.3, and it is running at this host and the 4723 port, sorry, which is a local host, and also have UI Automator 2 driver and XUI test driver installed in my system. Okay, let me run the script and see how it works. Okay, let me start. Those are the application, and you can see the logs. Yep, it installed the application, it found that element, it clicked on it, and it quit the session. So it is a successful run. Now what we will do is that we will read the logs and understand what is happening behind the scenes. Okay, let me go back to the initial log. Yep, so after the server is started, you can see that the client is sending the post request to this endpoint with all the capabilities that we have set. Now, how do we make sure that the request that is sent is correct and to the required endpoint? So what I'm trying to say here is that our Java client libraries is adhering to the W3C WebDriver Protocol or not. Let us cross check that. For that, what you have to do, you have to go to a website called W3C WebDriver Protocol. You just type W3C WebDriver Protocol in the Google, and the first link, right, you click on it. Now this is the WebDriver Protocol W3C standard protocol defined in this page. Now for creating a new session, let's see what is the request and the targeted endpoint. Let me type new session. Yeah, this is the one. Now as you can see here, to create a new session, the HTTP method is post request, and this is the endpoint it needs to send the request to. Is it matching? Yes, it is. Okay, now let us see how that is currently happening. So for that, we have to go to the dependencies which we have downloaded here, and there is one clause present under this Selenium remote driver library. Let me open this remote folder and the codec. Yeah, so this is the class. And one more thing I would like to highlight here is that see, as per the my research online and also reading multiple blogs, so this is the class which I have found, but again I'm not 100% sure this is the one it is currently using under the hood, but I'm 80 to 90% sure that this is the class it might be using, because I went through most of the libraries. I did not find any method which is forming this HTTP request. But if you guys know which is the actual class that is internally using, please post it in the comment section so that it helps the testing community. Okay, but anyways, let us see the implementation of it and understand like how it could be a gist of it, at least how the command, the HTTP request is formed. Now for that new session, as you can see here, this is the method define command, and it is, if you see here, this is the variable that they are passing. There's a string variable which says new session, and this is the post method. If we go inside here, so we can see that HTTP method dot post. That means this method is creating a post request to this endpoint. Is it matching with the one which we have just seen? Yes, it is. So internally, this is how it is forming the HTTP request command for this session endpoint. Okay. Now, after we sending this request, what is happening here is that first Appium driver is trying to match, as you can see here, attempting to find matching driver for automation name UI Automator 2 and platform name Android. Now, after that is matched, it needs to check whether that UI Automator 2 driver is installed on the system or not. It is installed. Now, it is getting that UI Automator 2 driver and it is trying to create a session with that. We can see here is that creating a session with W3C protocol, the Android UI Automator 2 driver, and the session ID is, session is created with this session ID. Okay, this is very much important, session ID. Now, after that, as I told you, it creates a session with this UI Automator 2 driver. After that, with the help of ADB commands, it needs to first install the UI Automator 2 server. But before that, where it needs to install? It needs to install on the targeted emulator, right? First, it needs to form a connection with this emulator. It needs to find that emulator. Then only it has to install that UI Automator 2 server. So that is what currently it is happening here. As you can see here is that this UI Automator 2 driver with the help of ADB commands, what it is trying to do here is that, as I told you already that ADB is a part of Android SDK. So as you can see here that using ADB from users my name library Android SDK folder. Okay, it is a part of Android SDK. Now what it is trying to do is that the emulator name which I have given here, the Pixel 8 Pro, it is trying to find that emulator and it is checking whether it is connected or not. Okay, and it got the response, it is one emulator is connected. After that, what it is trying to do here is that it is not launching this Android virtual device because I've already kept it running before the script execution, because it was already running. That is what it says here. Now using device emulator 5554. So one more thing here is that when you guys are running a single emulator, that is single Android virtual device, the ID of that particular emulator will always be this. Okay, and if you're running multiple, then this ID changes. It could be like 5553 or 5551 or 2, whatever it is. But if it is a single emulator running, so this is a unique ID. Now after that, what it is trying to do is that now it has to install the UI Automator 2 server. Now where that is happening, let me check that. Let us scroll down a bit and read logs one by one. Yeah, first that is installing the Appium IO settings. If I see here, I'll show you that. Yeah, this is the Appium settings. So this is also required for managing the system level settings during automation, such as disabling Wi-Fi, granting app permissions, handling notifications, and setting orientations and all. Okay. Now after that, what it is trying to do is it needs to install the UI Automator 2 server. As you can see here, yeah, it is getting the package information of that UI Automator 2 server. Now using the ADB commands, which I have explained here, using the ADB commands, it has to install the UI Automator 2 server. So this is the process that is currently happening here. Now getting the installed status of Appium UI Automator 2 server test, and it is also checking the app certification of that. Yeah, now after that, right, as you can see here, Appium UI automator server test is installed. Okay, so after that is done, it has to install the application, the testing application. So that is happening in the line. Let us see that where it is. So again, it is installing the required that UI automator to server file, and also it is running it. Yep. Now this is the name of our application. Let me show you that. Yeah, as you can see, this is the name of the application, API demos -debug.apk. Okay, it is where this is the path where it is located. Now it is checking whether that particular application is already installed or not. See, it is not installed. Now it is trying to install that application, and it installed. Okay, and it is saying how much time it took to install that application. Okay, it took 244 milliseconds. Then after that, it has to launch the UI automator to server. Okay, so it is launching UI automator to server on the emulator. Now after starting, it needs to send the response that it is ready to accept the commands. So where that is actually happening, we are waiting to be for the UI automator to be online. Now here, yes, as you can see here, it is sending the response to the UI automator to driver saying that I am ready to accept the command. That means UI automator to server is ready to accept the commands. So after that, now UI automator to driver will send this request to the UI automator to server, that is creating a session. So as you can see here, we are proxying the post the session, the request that UI automator to driver received to the UI automator to server. Now after session is successful session creation, it is responding back to the UI automator to driver with this status code, and also a session ID is created. Now if you see, observe this carefully, the session ID, this session ID which is created, it's between the UI automator to server and the UI automator to driver, or you can say the Appium server. But this is not the same as the session ID that is created between this Appium server and your test script. Let us check that. So the session ID created between UI automator to server and UI automator to driver, which is started with 03 EC, but the initial session ID created between your test script and the Appium server starts with 60. Okay, so two different session IDs are created between two different components. Now if we go back to where we left, so yeah, so we got the successful response from the UI automator to server saying that a new session is created, and with all the device details. As you can see here, this is the Pixel 8 Pro details, and the platform name is this, and emulator ID is this. This is the session ID, and also it is sending all other details of that particular device. For example, what is the career name of the emulator? If you want to see that, let me just open the device and go to settings, and about device, about emulator, and as you can see here, yeah, sim status is T-Mobile, so that it is sending, and also the language is set in that device, who is the manufacturer of the device, and what is the model. If you can see, yeah, model here, right, it is SDK _G phone 64 _ ARM 64, like that. So every details of the required details of that particular emulator is sent back to the UI automator to driver. Now again, it is checking all other basics required things. After that, now UI automator to driver is responding to client, that means to us, with the same details. Okay, so all these details are sent back to us. You can see that our test script, and this symbol hyphens, that it is we are getting a response from the UI automator to driver or through Appium server, and this is the status code, that means it's a success. Now this line of code is executed. Now after we got the session ID, we need to use that session ID to find that element for this locator value graphics. For that, let us see what should be the HTTP command or HTTP request. Let us go back to this WebDriver protocol again. Now here we need to find element. Let me search with find element. Yep. Now if you see the find element, again the request HTTP request method is post, and we need to hit this endpoint. Let's check whether the same endpoint is getting created in the client library. Let me search with find element. Yeah. So find element, post method, session ID. If I go back to session ID, it is appended with / session and session ID. Don't worry about that. In the runtime, this value will get replaced with the actual session ID. So is it the same? Session / session ID. Now if I go back to the find element, so that covers this, and the endpoint, the targeted endpoint is element. So both are matching. Okay. Now if I go back to the log and see, what we are trying to do is that same thing, post session, and this is a session ID which initially created. That means this, where is this? Yep. Where is it? Okay. Yeah, here it is. This is a session ID. For example, let me just store it somewhere for easy access. So this is the first session ID that is created between your test script and the Appium server. And the session ID that got created between UI Automator 2 driver and the UI Automator 2 server is this. This is the session ID, right? Yep. Let us paste that here, okay, for our easy reference. Now all our request from the test script has to use this session ID, the first one. Let us see whether that is happening or not. Now after the session is created, now we are hitting this element endpoint, and this is a session ID that we are using. That means the session ID is correct. Okay, and element, and this is the value, that is the graphics, and we're using this locator value, accessibility ID. Okay, I have created one more PPT for that. Yeah, so this is the one. So what we are trying to do here is that, as you can see here, we are trying to send a post request to this element with the session ID. Again, it's a dummy session ID which was created using a PPT. You can ignore that, but this is the actual session ID that got created in the last run. Okay, now we are sending this request to the Appium server. Now this Appium server is routing this request to the UI Automator 2 driver. Now this UI Automator 2 driver has to send the request or proxy the request to the UI Automator 2 server, which is running on the Android device. But there is one important thing we need to notice here that I'll show first here. So now UI Automator 2 driver, it's calling the find element with the graphics and this session ID. Now it is proxying that request to UI Automator 2 server like this. That means it is converting this high level request to the platform specific request. In this request, we are having only two key value pairs, one with using key and the accessibility ID, and the value is graphics. But when it is sending the request to the UI Automator 2 server, if you see here, this is the platform specific request where the same thing is converted into the a low level platform specific request. That means here it is changed to strategy, and the selector is graphics, contexting nothing. That means it is trying to find that element on the current context, and multiple is false, means it is trying to find a single element but not a list of elements. Okay, this is the important thing that is currently happening here. That means each and every request that we make to the UI Automator 2 driver, that means to the Appium server, will be converted into the platform specific request before it sends to the UI Automator 2 server, because that is how the architecture is designed. Okay, now after this sending this request to the UI Automator 2 server, now UI Automator 2 server will interact with the UI Automator 2 framework, and it tries to find the element on that particular UI, and if it finds the element, it returns the response back to the UI Automator 2 driver, and again it will come to the test script. But if you observe one thing carefully here, we got the response 200 saying that but again, one more thing we need to check here is the session ID. Now, while sending the request from Appium UI Automator 2 driver to UI Automator 2 server, you can see that the session ID which is used by it is different. That means this is a second session ID. This is the one it is using, not the first one which was created during the test script, and that is your client and the Appium server. This is one more difference. Now it got the response with 200 status. That means this element is currently found on that particular UI and it is returning the element reference ID or reference value. But if you observe carefully, let me just copy this and go back to IntelliJ and paste it here. Again, it is just a sample JSON file that I have created. Yeah, let me zoom it. Okay, so this is the session ID. Now, if you see here, the same reference value is sent in two different keys. One is in element and one more is in element hyphen this digit. Now, why it is happening? Because earlier versions were using JSON wire protocol and element was the key name that was used to identify the web element. Now in the W3C WebDriver Protocol, this is the key name that is used to recognize any web element. Let us cross check that. Let me copy this and go back to W3C WebDriver Protocol and try to find it. Okay, as you can see here, this is now the web element identifier. So all the elements that you try to find and interact with will have this key. Only the thing is that will be where it is the reference value. But to support the backward compatibility, still the same reference value of that particular element will be sent to these two keys for the framework that are still using the older versions. Okay, and one more thing I would like to discuss here is that you guys might have encountered StaleElementReference Exception. We know that when StaleElementReference Exception comes, that that particular element is no longer attached to the DOM or the page got refreshed and all. But internally what is happening is the reference ID, that means this ID that was created initially and you were trying to interact with that element, that reference ID is now changed. That means when you try to find an element, this was the ID. Let's assume that this was the ID and you perform some action on it or the page got refreshed. Now that element reference ID got changed from D to something like this. Okay, but if your script is still trying to find the element using the same old reference ID, you will get the StaleElementReference Exception. So internally this is what is happening. That means the reference value of that particular element is no longer present. That means that ID got changed or the element ID is stale now. Okay, I hope you got the picture, like what is internally happening in the StaleElementReference Exceptions. Okay, now let us go back to that wherever. Yeah, so here we were. Okay, now we got the response saying that yes, element ID, this is the element ID. Now your Automator 2 driver has to send the response back to the test script. As you can see here, it is sending the response back to that. Now if you see the session ID, it is now a different session ID. That means the one which we created initially. Now we got the 200 response. So after that, what we have to do is that we need to click on that. Now for the click, what should be the HTTP method? Let us check that. But before checking here, let us go here and type click. Yeah, so if I see here again, this is also a post request to this endpoint. Let us cross check whether the same thing is defined here or not. Okay, here it is, the click element. Now again, this is also post request, looks good to me. And element ID, so this element ID is having a session ID and also appended with element /ID. Again, this will get replaced with the actual reference ID that is created or that is found during the request. So this. Okay, now if I go back to the code again, so session ID, so what is the session ID comprises of? This value, is it same? Yes, /session and the session ID, that's correct. Now again it is appended with element, that looks good, and the ID, yes, it is ID. Now this variable is sent to this and it is again appended with this click endpoint. So both are matching. So if you go back here, now we have to send again one more post request to that particular element. If you see, this is the element we need to use to perform click action. So session, and this is the session ID, and the element endpoint. And what is the element ID? This is the element ID, right? And we are using that element ID, and we are performing click operation. That means we are sending this request to this endpoint. And if you see here, this is the key ID and this is the value of that element ID. Sorry, this is the value of that element, that is same. Now let me open another PPT. Yeah, so this is for click operation. So we are sending a post request with this element reference ID and to the click endpoint, and now again that is converted into the platform specific request. As you can see here it is ID, but when it is proxying it is element. Now same thing we can see here as well. So UI Automator 2 driver is proxying this request. That means it is just routing this request to the UI Automator 2 server with the body. What is the body? Element. So same thing have written here, but again you can ignore the element IDs. This was the old element ID. Okay, now we got the element. That means, sorry, we got the response as 200. That means UI Automator 2 server performed click operation on that. And also if you see the session ID, when the UI Automator 2 driver is sending the request to the UI Automator 2 server, it is making sure that it is using the session ID that is created between those two components, but not the one which was created in the client and the Appium server. Okay, now after that, what is our code doing? After performing click operation, we are ending the session, quitting the session. So is the same thing happening here? Okay, so we got the response from the Android UI Automator 2 driver as well, saying that it is a success, 200. So after that, we are sending a delete session request. Let us cross check that also here. Let me try with delete, or sorry, delete. Yeah, deleting the session. So again, it's a delete and the session and the session ID. Is it the same thing in this class as well? Let us check that. Okay, it is not delete, or it could be end session, I guess. Delete cookie. Okay, let me see the new session. I think, yeah, sorry, it's a quit. Actually it should be, yeah, it is a quit. So quit is nothing but it is quitting the driver here. And delete, is it the delete same here as well? Yes, it is delete. So it is delete. And what is the session ID? Session ID is this, and the session the actual session ID value, is it same? Yes, it is same. So if you observe this carefully, so all the request that we are sending is adhering to the W3C WebDriver Protocol, and looks like this is the underlying class that is used to perform those, I mean to get those or form those HTTP requests. Yeah, so after the session is ended, again it is deleting the UI Automator 2 server on these the emulator, and the same thing getting proxy to the UI Automator 2 server as well. Now if you see here, everything is getting killed and the session is ended, and we got the response from the driver saying that the session is ended. Okay, so I know it's too much to take in, but it's worth knowing everything in detail though. So I think yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If yes, please do like this video, share with your friends, colleagues, and also don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more such contents. Thanks for your time. Have a great day.